There is a conversation in John's Gospel that almost everyone has heard one line from, and almost nobody has heard the rest of. It happens at night, two men indoors alone. One of them is a religious authority, a member of the ruling council, a scholar, a man with a reputation to protect. The other is a traveling teacher from Galilee who has just caused a public disturbance in the temple. And in the middle of that conversation comes a sentence so famous it appears on placards at sporting events, printed on carrier bags, held up behind goalposts. For God so loved the world. Most people could complete it. Very few could tell you who was in the room. Fewer still know that the man he was talking to appears twice more in the story. Once in a council chamber, arguing procedure, and once at a tomb, carrying about 100 pounds of burial spices through a city that had just executed the person he was going to bury. That is the story this video is about. Not the famous verse, though we will get to it, but the man it was said to, and what happened to him afterwards. Because Nicodemus is the closest thing the Gospels have to a study of somebody changing their mind slowly. Not in a flash, not knocked to the ground on a road. Slowly over what appears to be about 3 years, at real cost, in the face of everything his position and training and colleagues were telling him. If you have ever found faith to be a difficult, halting, embarrassing business rather than a sudden certainty, this is your chapter. Start with who he was, because the text is precise about it, and the precision matters. John introduces him with 3 pieces of information, and each one is doing work. He was a Pharisee. That word has taken a beating in English. We use it to mean a hypocrite or a legalist, and that is unfair, and it obscures the story. The Pharisees were a serious religious movement committed to applying the law of Moses to ordinary daily life, in a country under foreign occupation, with enormous care and at some personal cost. They were the party of the devout and the studious. Whatever the arguments Jesus had with them, and there were many, they were arguments between people who took the same text seriously. He was a ruler of the Jews, which in this context means a member of the Sanhedrin, the ruling council. 70 men plus the high priest, the highest religious and judicial authority available to a Jewish community under Roman rule. This is not a village elder. This is a man at the top of his profession. And later in the conversation, Jesus calls him the teacher of Israel, with the definite article, which is a striking form of address and suggests a man of some standing as an interpreter of Scripture. So devout, learned, senior, respected. And he came at night. Now, the night has been argued about for 2,000 years, and it is worth setting out the possibilities rather than picking the most dramatic one. The obvious reading is fear. He did not want to be seen. A senior member of the council paying a private call on a Galilean troublemaker. Days or weeks after that troublemaker overturned the tables in the temple courts is a career problem at best. John's gospel returns repeatedly to people who believed, but would not say so publicly, precisely because of what it would cost them. The second reading is more generous, and it is genuinely plausible. Rabbinic study commonly happened at night, after the working day, when it was quiet and there were no interruptions. Coming at night might simply mean coming when serious conversation was possible. The third reading is literary. John uses light and darkness throughout his gospel as a running theme, and the conversation itself ends on exactly that image, men loving darkness rather than light. So the night may be marking where Nicodemus is starting from. Here is the thing. These are not mutually exclusive, and the text does not resolve them. What we can say is that John mentions the night 3 separate times in connection with this man, including at the very end when he reappears. And a detail repeated 3 times in a carefully written book is not an accident. He is the man who came in the dark. John wants you to remember it. And it is worth understanding what it would actually have cost him to be seen, because fear is too vague a word for a specific professional situation. The Sanhedrin was not a debating society. It was the governing religious authority, and it operated under a delicate arrangement with Rome. Its standing depended on keeping order, and its members were men with property, families, students, and reputations built over a lifetime. By this point, Jesus had already overturned the tables in the temple courts, a direct public challenge to an operation licensed by the priestly leadership during the busiest week of the year. Whatever else the council thought of him, they had noticed him. For a member of that body to be observed calling privately on the man responsible would not be a scandal exactly. It would be worse. It would be a question mark. Where does he stand? Is he sound? And once that question exists about somebody in a governing body, it does not go away. So the risk was not violence. It was the slow erosion of standing, being quietly excluded from the conversations that matter, having your judgment doubted, watching younger men be preferred. That is a real cost, and it is not a contemptible thing to want to avoid. Most of us would take the night visit. What the passage does, gently, without a word of accusation, is put that entirely reasonable caution beside a light that has just arrived in the world, and let the reader draw the comparison. So he arrives, and he opens with a compliment. Rabbi, we know you are a teacher come from God, because nobody could do the signs you do unless God were with him. That is a careful, generous, diplomatic opening, and notice the word we. Not I know, we know. He is speaking for a group. Somewhere in that council, there were others who had watched what was happening and reached a similar private conclusion, and had said so to each other, quietly, and had not said so anywhere else. It also tells you what had persuaded them, the signs, what he had done. And then Jesus does something that reads, on the surface, as rude. He does not acknowledge the compliment. He does not thank him for coming. He answers a question Nicodemus has not asked. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. That is a strange response to a courteous greeting, and it looks like a change of subject. It is not. It is a diagnosis. Nicodemus has come to place him. He has assessed the evidence, formed a view, and arrived to establish where this teacher fits in the framework. A man from God, certainly, and now let us discuss what kind. And the reply is that the framework itself is the problem. You cannot fit this into what you already have. You would have to start again. Now the famous phrase, and here we need to be careful, because English loses something the Greek is doing. The word translated again is *Anothen*, and it genuinely carries 2 meanings. It can mean again, a second time. It can also mean from above. That is not a translator's difficulty to be tidied away. It is a deliberate double meaning, and the whole conversation turns on it, because Jesus means one thing and Nicodemus hears the other. Jesus means from above, born from God, from outside, from a source that is not you. Nicodemus hears again, a second time, repeat the process. And that mishearing produces one of the most human lines in the Gospels. How can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? People sometimes read that as sarcasm or as stupidity, and it is neither. It is a serious man taking a statement seriously and finding it impossible. And there is something quietly moving in the way he phrases it. He does not say, "How can a man be born again?" He says, "When he is old." He is talking about himself. Here is a senior scholar, a lifetime of study behind him, a position achieved, a reputation established, an understanding of God built carefully over decades, being told he needs to start from the beginning. The objection is not intellectual. It is the ache of a man who suspects the answer might be true and cannot see how it could possibly be available to him at this stage. It is too late. I am already formed. I have been this person for a very long time. That is not the complaint of a hostile critic. It is the complaint of someone who wants it. So Jesus answers again, and this time he expands rather than repeats. Born of water and the Spirit. Flesh gives birth to flesh. The Spirit gives birth to spirit. Do not be astonished that I said you must be born from above. Then comes an image, and it is the most beautiful thing in the passage. The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. And once again, there is a double meaning that English cannot carry. The Greek word pneuma means both wind and spirit. It is the same word. So the sentence is doing something a translation can only describe. The wind blows where it wishes. The Spirit blows where it wishes. You can hear it. You cannot trace it. You cannot direct it. For a Pharisee, that is a genuinely difficult idea, and we should be honest about why rather than treating him as slow. His entire discipline was about how to live rightly, how to apply the law faithfully, in detail, day by day. It was a system of obedience, and it was a serious and honorable one. What you did mattered. And he is being told that the decisive thing is not something you do. It arrives. It moves where it chooses. You can no more organize it than you can organize the weather. That is not an easy thing to hear if your whole life has been about diligence. It sounds at first like being told the effort was wasted. And it is worth defending him here, because modern readers tend to be unfairly quick with the Pharisees. Consider what his position actually involved. He lived in an occupied country, under an empire that had swallowed his nation's independence, at a moment when the pull towards simply assimilating, speaking Greek, adopting Roman habits, letting the old distinctives quietly lapse, was enormous. The Pharisaic project was a response to exactly that pressure. It held that the law was not a museum piece for priests in a temple, but something that shaped how an ordinary person ate, worked, rested, and treated their neighbor every day, whoever was governing. It was a strategy for a people remaining themselves under occupation, and it largely worked. It is a substantial reason Judaism survived the destruction that followed. That is not legalism. It is faithfulness under pressure, sustained at real cost across generations. So when Nicodemus struggles, he is not a small man failing to grasp a simple point. He is a serious man discovering that the framework he has served, which was honorable and which was working, is not the thing that finally counts. The gospel does not sneer at him for that, and neither should we. It lets the difficulty stand as a genuine difficulty, which is precisely why he is the right person for this conversation. If the offer had been made to someone with nothing to lose, it would prove very little. Made to a man with everything invested in the older answer, it costs something to accept, and the text is honest that he does not accept it on the night. Nicodemus asks, "How can these things be?" And that is his last recorded line in the conversation. From here, Jesus speaks, and Nicodemus, as far as the text tells us, listens. What follows is a short discourse, and it contains two things worth stopping on. The first is an image from deep in Israel's own history, and it is chosen with great care. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. That refers to an episode in the book of Numbers. The people, wandering in the desert, complaining bitterly, are afflicted by venomous snakes. Moses is instructed to make a bronze serpent and set it on a pole, and anyone who has been bitten and looks at it lives. Now consider why that is the image he reaches for of everything in the scriptures. It is not heroic. There is no army, no miracle of deliverance, no parting sea. It is a strange, almost primitive story about people who are already dying being told to do one thing: look. They cannot cure themselves. They cannot earn it. There is no ritual to perform and no standard to meet. They are simply told where to direct their attention. There is a further edge to it that a scholar of his standing would have felt immediately. The bronze serpent has a difficult afterlife in the Hebrew Bible. Centuries later, in the book of Kings, we learn that the Israelites had kept it and had begun burning incense to it. King Hezekiah, in his reforms, broke it in pieces. So the object that had saved them became, in time, an object they worshipped and had to be destroyed. Nicodemus would have known that. Every serious student of the scriptures did. And it carries a warning that lands very close to home for a religious professional. The thing God gives you to look through can become the thing you look at. The instrument becomes the idol. The system built to point at God ends up receiving the attention itself. That is uncomfortably near the argument being made in the temple a few days earlier, and it is very near the argument being made to him now. He is not being told his tradition was false. He is being told it was pointing somewhere, and that the somewhere has arrived, and that continuing to venerate the signpost is the one mistake his own scriptures record his ancestors making with this exact object. For a man who has spent his life on the question of what to do that is a precise and pointed choice. The bronze serpent is the least active thing in the entire Hebrew Bible. And then, immediately after it, comes the sentence everyone knows. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. We have heard it so often that it has gone smooth, like a coin rubbed featureless. So notice two things it actually says. It says the world asterisk, not the nation, not the devout, not the qualified. Cosmos, in the Greek, the whole created order, including the part of it that is hostile. And it says whoever, not the learned, not the Pharisee, and not the council member either, whoever. There is a third word worth slowing down on, and it is the verb. God gave asterisk. Not lent, not offered on terms, not made available to those who qualify. Gave. A gift is a peculiar thing to be offered if you are a person who has spent decades earning. Earning is dignified. You know where you stand, and what you hold by right. A gift puts you in the position of someone who has received something they did not produce and cannot repay, which is a harder posture for an accomplished man than almost any other. That is the same idea as being born from above, stated a second way for someone who has just said he cannot see how it could work. You did not arrange your first birth either. Nobody does. It was done for you before you could contribute anything to it, and you spent the rest of your life on what followed. Consider who is sitting there. A man who has spent his life inside a system of qualification, of who is clean, who is observant, who is inside the boundary and who is not, and by what standard. And he is told that the offer is to the world, and the condition is trust. The verse that follows is less quoted, and it is the sharper one. God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. Which answers a question Nicodemus has not asked out loud, but which any senior religious figure in an occupied country in the 1st century was certainly asking. Is this judgment? Is this the reckoning arriving? And the answer is, not yet and not primarily. That is not what this is. Then the passage closes on the image. The whole scene has been built around. This is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light, because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does wicked things hates the light, and does not come to the light, lest his deeds be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light. And Nicodemus is sitting in a room at night, having come in the dark specifically so that nobody would see him. You are meant to feel that. The passage does not accuse him. It simply places him inside its own metaphor and lets him sit there. The conversation ends without a resolution. John does not tell us what Nicodemus said, or whether he agreed, or how he left. He simply disappears from the narrative. That silence is deliberate, and a lesser writer would have filled it with a decision. And here is where most retellings stop, which is a pity, because the story is not over. He comes back twice, and the 2 returns are the point. The first is in chapter 7, some time later. The temple authorities have sent officers to arrest Jesus, and the officers have come back without him, saying that no one ever spoke like this man. The chief priests and Pharisees are angry. There is a sneering exchange about whether any of the authorities or Pharisees have believed in him, and a dismissal of the crowd as an ignorant mob. And a voice speaks up in that room. Does our Lord judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does? It is Nicodemus, and John, who has not forgotten, adds the detail, he who had gone to him before. Now notice what that intervention is and what it is not. It is not a declaration of faith. He does not stand and say he believes. He makes a procedural point that the law requires a hearing before a judgment. It is, on the face of it, a small and technical thing to say, a lawyer's objection. But look at the room he says it in. The mood is contemptuous. The consensus is settled. And a member of the council speaks, in public, against the direction of travel, on behalf of a man everyone present has already decided about. The response is immediate, and it is exactly what you would expect. Are you from Galilee too? Search and see that no prophet arises from Galilee. That is not an argument. It is a warning dressed as a sneer. Careful, people are going to think you are one of them. And that is the cost of speaking up in a room where you are the only one, not persecution. Just the sudden awareness that your colleagues are now looking at you differently. He does not press it. He does not defend Jesus further. He says his piece, and as far as the record goes, sits down. And notice what he chose to say, because it is cleverer than it first appears. He does not argue that Jesus is right. He does not offer an opinion on the man at all. He appeals to something none of them can dismiss without embarrassing themselves: their own law and the requirement that a man be heard before he is judged. That is the only argument available to him that cannot simply be waved away as partisanship. Say, I think he may be from God, and you are one of them, and the conversation is over. Say, our law requires a hearing, and every person in the room has to either agree or admit they are proceeding without one. It is the intervention of a man who knows exactly how much weight he can put on the ice. You can read that as calculation, and partly it is. But it is also the instinct of someone trained to care about doing things properly. And it is worth noticing that the procedural objection was, in the end, the correct one. He was judged without a proper hearing. Nicodemus was right about the law, and being right about the law changed nothing at all. That is its own quiet lesson about what institutions do when they have already decided. It would be easy to read that as cowardice. I think it is more interesting than that. He is a man moving from a private night visit to a public sentence in a hostel room. That is not nothing. It is just not everything. And then the third appearance, which is the one that changes how you read the other two. It is after the crucifixion. Joseph of Arimathea, another wealthy council member described as a secret disciple, asks Pilate for the body. And John records that Nicodemus came too. He brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 Roman pounds in weight. Stop on that quantity, because it is not incidental. That is somewhere in the region of 30 kilograms of imported aromatic spice. It is an enormous amount, a quantity associated with a royal burial. It would have been extremely expensive, and it is not something you can pick up quietly on the way past. Two men who had both kept their sympathies private now carry that through Jerusalem, in daylight, hours after a public execution for sedition, to bury a man the council they sat on had handed to Rome. There is no way to do that discreetly. Everyone would know. Everyone did know. John names them both. And the naming is itself the point. These are not anonymous sympathizers. John records two members of the ruling council, by name, performing the burial of a man that council had delivered to the governor. He expects his readers to recognize them, and he expects some of them to still be alive to be recognized. A secret disciple is a contradiction that can only last so long. At the tomb, it stops being possible. And consider the timing, which is the part that undoes you. He does not come forward when it might have helped. He is not there when the arrest happens, or at the trial, or in the crowd. He comes forward at the moment when there is nothing whatsoever to gain. When the man is dead, the movement is finished, the disciples have scattered, and any reasonable person would conclude it was over. The one moment when declaring yourself buys you absolutely nothing is the moment he chooses. And there is a detail in the practicalities that is easy to miss and worth pausing on. Handling a body meant ritual defilement. Under the purity laws he had spent his life observing, contact with a corpse rendered a person unclean for 7 days. And this was Passover week, the most significant festival in the calendar. So the act did not merely expose him socially. It excluded him, by the very law he had devoted himself to, from the observances of the holiest week of the year. He would have known that before he set out. He would have calculated it, being the sort of man who calculated things. He went anyway. There is something almost unbearably fitting in that. The man who could not see how a person could start again, who asked how these things could be, who had built a life on careful observance, chose, at the end, to make himself ritually unclean in order to bury the man who had told him the observance was not the point. He did not answer the question in the room that night. He answered it 3 years later, with 30 kilograms of spice and 7 days of uncleanness, and without saying anything at all. That is why the £100 matters. It is not a discreet gesture. It is a public, expensive, unmistakable act, performed at the point of maximum cost and minimum benefit. The man who came at night came in the day. So what should we take from this? 3 things, and the first is about how slowly it happened. We tend to prefer conversion stories with a moment in them, a blinding light, a date, a before and after. Those exist, and they are real. Nicodemus is the other kind, and the gospel gives him just as much dignity. 3 appearances across 3 years. A private conversation he did not understand, a cautious procedural objection that got him mocked. And finally, an act that cost him a great deal, at a moment when it could not possibly have benefited him. Nobody watching the first scene would have called him a follower. He asked a confused question and vanished. If you had assessed him after chapter 3, you would have written him off. That should be a comfort to anybody whose faith has been a slow, awkward, halting business rather than a lightning strike. The text does not treat that as a lesser version. It follows him to the end. And notice that nobody chased him. There is no scene where Jesus seeks him out, no rebuke for the caution, no follow-up visit to close the deal. After that night, the initiative is entirely his. He is left with an unanswered question and a very great deal to lose, and what he does with it over the next 3 years happens off the page, in rooms we are not shown. Which is, if you think about it, how it works for most people. The moment of clear challenge is brief. The decision is made slowly afterwards, unobserved, in circumstances nobody records. The second thing is about what he was actually being asked to give up. It was not his morality. He was, by every indication, a genuinely good man, devout, careful, honest enough to go and look for himself rather than repeat what his colleagues were saying. What he was asked to surrender was the idea that being good was the mechanism, that a life of study and observance and diligence was what put him right with God. And it is worth being careful here, because this is where the passage is most often misused. Nothing in it says the diligence was worthless. Nicodemus is never told to stop studying, stop observing, or think less of the law. Jesus quotes that same law to him and expects him to know it well enough to follow an allusion to a bronze serpent without explanation. The claim is narrower and harder. It is that all of it was pointing at something and could not itself be the destination. Which means what he loses is not his life's work. It is the asterisk status of his life's work, its position as the thing that settles the account. The work remains, it simply stops being the payment. For most people, that distinction, sounds academic. For a man who has ordered 40 years around it, it is the difference between standing on something and standing on nothing. That is why he says, when he is old, rather than how is it possible. He is not asking a question about mechanics. He is asking whether there is any way back for someone who has already built the whole house. That is far harder to give up than a vice you can be ashamed of. An achievement you are quietly proud of, that you built carefully over decades, and that everyone around you respects, that is much harder to set down. Born from above means the decisive thing came from outside, and you did not produce it. For a man who had produced a great deal, that is a genuine loss, and the text lets him feel it. How can a man be born when he is old? And the third thing is the smallest, and it is the one I find hardest to shake. John, writing decades later, remembered the night. He mentions it every single time. At the first meeting, again in the council chamber, and again at the tomb, this Nicodemus, who came to him first by night. You could read that as a reproach, a permanent asterisk against his name. I do not think it is, because of where the last one falls. The final mention of the night comes in the sentence describing the one thing he did in broad daylight, at enormous cost, in front of everybody. The night is mentioned there precisely so that you measure the distance. It is not there to shame him. It is there because you cannot see how far somebody has traveled unless you are also shown where they set out from. He is not remembered as the man who came at night. He is remembered as the man who came at night, and then came back, and then came out. If you are somewhere in the middle of that sequence, still asking how these things can be, still doing the careful, private version of it, the gospel does not hurry you. It simply notes where you started and keeps following. Scripture and sources. This account draws on the Gospel of John, chapter 3 for the conversation itself, and chapters 7 and 19 for the two later appearances, together with the account of the bronze serpent in Numbers chapter 21 that Jesus refers to directly. Background on the Pharisees as a religious movement, on the composition and authority of the Sanhedrin, and on first-century burial practice, and the cost and quantity of imported burial spices draws on the first-century historian Josephus, and on standard scholarship on the period. Where the text is genuinely open, above all why Nicodemus came at night, where fear, ordinary rabbinic custom, and John's own light and darkness imagery are all plausible and not mutually exclusive. This video sets out the possibilities rather than choosing the most dramatic one. The double meanings in the Greek, on being born again, or from above, and on the single word meaning both wind and spirit, are noted where an English translation cannot carry them.